The sound of Tallahassee Lassie once filled Studio B, and in the center of it all was Jimmy Peatross. Sharp steps, smooth dips, and the quiet confidence of a boy who made dancing look effortless. With Joan Buck at his side, he turned Jitterbug Contests into unforgettable performances, sealing their legacy with a 1959 victory and the unlikely prize of a French Simca car. In that moment, Jimmy wasn't just a teenager from Philadelphia. He was a star welcomed into living rooms across America. Yet fame on Bandstand was fleeting. For every dancer who became a household name, another quietly disappeared, leaving only memories on old black and white screens. Jimmy's story carries both brilliance and mystery. A boy who helped popularize the Strand and then stepped away, his name fading even as his steps lived on in memory. Stay with us as we retrace his journey. And if these stories of Bandstand stir your heart, subscribe so you won't miss the next dance down memory lane. Philadelphia in the 1940s and 1950s was a city alive with rhythm. Streetcars rattled, radios spilled out the latest rhythm and blues, and row houses stood shoulder to shoulder like an endless backdrop for teenage dreams. Into this setting was born James Vincent Peatross in December 1943, a boy whose footsteps would one day echo across a national stage. The city itself was a blend of working-class grit and post-war optimism, and for Jimmy, it became both playground and classroom. As a child, he carried the same restless energy that would later define his dancing. Friends remembered him as quick to laugh, always ready to turn the crackling beat from a transistor radio into an impromptu routine on the sidewalk. His parents valued responsibility and stability, yet they couldn't miss the way their son's body responded instinctively to music. What looked like play was, in truth, practice, each shuffle and dip sharpening the skill that would make him stand out. The culture of teenage America was just beginning to rise. Cars lined the streets, soda fountains brimmed with chatter, and rock and roll gave voice to a new generation. For Jimmy, these weren't just trends, they were invitations. He didn't want to sit still, he wanted to move with it, to be part of a culture exploding into color and sound. At home, his family offered encouragement. The Peatross household might not have imagined television cameras in their son's future, but they supported the hours he spent perfecting steps in scuffed shoes on living room floors. Brothers and sisters cheered when he spun. Neighbors smiled when he showed off a new move, and Jimmy learned early that dance was not just expression, but connection. Those ordinary moments, a radio humming late at night, the clatter of shoes worn thin on wooden floors, the warmth of a family who believed in him, became the unseen foundation of his rise. From these simple beginnings, Jimmy carried forward a quiet determination, and soon the ordinary rhythms of home would collide with the extraordinary pull of Studio B, where his steps would be broadcast to millions. By the late 1950s, American Bandstand had already become a ritual for countless teenagers. Every afternoon, after the final school bell rang, living rooms filled with the sound of rock and roll and the sight of ordinary kids becoming stars. For Jimmy Peatross, who had been practicing steps in his Philadelphia neighborhood, the idea of stepping into Studio B was both a dream and a dare. Friends talked about it constantly. The long lines, the thrill of seeing Dick Clark, the possibility of being on camera. Jimmy decided he had to see it for himself. That first day outside the studio, the line snaked around the block. Boys slicked back their hair, girls smoothed their skirts, and the air pulsed with anticipation. Jimmy stood among them, not just waiting but already moving, tapping his foot, running through steps under his breath. When the doors opened and the music spilled out, he stepped inside and found himself surrounded by floodlights, cameras, and the electricity of hundreds of teenagers ready to dance. The moment the music started, any nerves dissolved. Jimmy took to the floor with a confidence that surprised even him. The sharpness of his turns, the way he dipped at just the right beat, it caught the eyes of both the crowd and the cameras. What began as one dance became a moment of recognition. He wasn't just another face in the crowd. He was someone worth remembering. For the viewers at home, Jimmy's appearance felt fresh, like a new rhythm added to the familiar mix of bandstand afternoons. They didn't know his name yet, but they noticed the boy whose movements seemed a little crisper, whose timing felt exact, whose presence filled the screen without forcing it. That first broadcast changed everything. For Jimmy, it was proof that all those hours of practice had led him to the right place. For American Bandstand, it marked the arrival of a dancer who would soon define the look and feel of an era. And as the weeks went on, one partnership would turn his promising start into legend. Once Jimmy Peatross found his rhythm on Bandstand, the cameras never stopped seeking him out. Paired with Joan Buck, he became one half of a duo that seemed to embody the very spirit of the show. Their movements complemented each other seamlessly. Jimmy's precision and strength set the frame, while Joan's grace and fluidity filled it with light. When they danced, it wasn't just choreography. It was chemistry that felt both natural and magnetic. The high point came in 1959 during the Jitterbug Contest, when Tallahassee Lassie blared through the speakers and the floor shook with energy. Jimmy and Joan delivered a routine so flawless it seemed rehearsed by destiny itself. Each spin, each dip drew gasps from the crowd, and when the final note struck, the eruption of applause confirmed what everyone already sensed. They were the best. Their victory, capped with the unusual prize of a shiny French Simca automobile, became a bandstand legend, retold in fan magazines and whispered about in school hallways. But Jimmy's impact extended beyond a single contest. He helped popularize the Strand, a slower, graceful dance filled with dips and spins that became a staple of the late 1950s teen scene. Viewers at home copied his steps in living rooms, and magazines printed photos of him mid-dip, making him a style icon as well as a dancer. For a boy from Philadelphia, it was an astonishing transformation, from neighborhood sidewalks to the center of America's living rooms. Letters poured in, fan clubs formed, and the cameras lingered just a little longer when Jimmy and Joan stepped onto the floor. They weren't simply part of the program anymore. They were the highlight, the dancers' audiences tuned in to see. In a show filled with fresh faces, Jimmy had become a constant, the standard against which others were measured. It was a golden moment, shimmering with promise. But even as the music played and the applause swelled, the demands of fame and the pressures behind the curtain began to grow louder, preparing to test Jimmy in ways the audience never saw. By the time Jimmy Peatross and Joan Buck were established as partners, they had become one of Bandstand's defining images. Teenagers across America tuned in not only for the music, but to catch a glimpse of their flawless partnership. Jimmy's crisp control gave their routine structure, while Joan's elegance softened every line, creating a balance that seemed tailor-made for television. When the cameras swept the floor, it was often their steps that filled the screen. The response from fans was immediate. Letters addressed simply to Jimmy and Joan, American Bandstand, arrived at the studio, overflowing with admiration. Fan clubs formed in cities far beyond Philadelphia, each claiming the duo as their favorites. Teen magazines placed their photos on glossy pages, sometimes hinting at romance, sometimes praising their skill. Whether the stories exaggerated or not, one thing was clear. Together, they had captured the imagination of a generation. Behind the curtain, however, the life of a bandstand regular was far from effortless. The show maintained strict standards, no moves considered too wild, no behavior that might tarnish the clean-cut image of the program. Jimmy and Joan worked within those lines, finding ways to keep their routines exciting while never crossing the boundaries. There were moments of tension, a stumble on live television, the stress of competition with other pairs, the quiet jealousy of dancers who wanted the same spotlight. Yet Jimmy carried himself with a steadiness that helped them weather the pressure. What truly set the duo apart was their trust in one another. When Jimmy dipped Joan into a daring low spin, it wasn't just skill, it was confidence built on hours of practice and an unspoken understanding. The audience could feel that bond, and it made their performances resonate even more. For bandstand fans, Jimmy and Joan represented possibility. Ordinary teenagers transformed into national figures, standing side by side in the glow of the cameras. But for the dancers themselves, the spotlight was both a gift and a burden, one that would soon press harder as the demands of life began to change. For all the excitement that swirled around Jimmy Peatross, the shine of American Bandstand could not last forever. The schedule was relentless, and what once felt like an after-school adventure began to resemble a commitment that pulled him in every direction. Schoolwork, family responsibilities, and the unspoken pressure to remain flawless on camera created a weight that even the most gifted teenagers struggled to carry. Behind the smiles and polished steps, exhaustion often lingered. His partnership with Joan Buck, though celebrated by fans, also carried its own pressures. Audiences adored them, magazines speculated about their closeness, and other dancers measured themselves against their success. For two young people who had started simply because they loved to dance, the scrutiny was intense. Every performance was expected to match the magic of the last, and every small slip could be magnified by the gaze of millions watching at home. The cultural landscape was shifting too. New dances surged in popularity almost overnight, and competition for camera time grew fiercer. Jimmy, known for his crisp style, now faced the challenge of staying relevant in an environment that demanded constant reinvention. What had once been pure joy began to feel like obligation, and the dance floor that once freed him started to confine him. Eventually, the decision to step away became unavoidable. There was no dramatic farewell, no final announcement, simply a quiet fading from the screen. One week, viewers saw Jimmy spinning Joan into another perfect dip. The next, his absence was filled by other eager faces. For those who had followed him faithfully, the silence was startling. Leaving Bandstand was bittersweet. Jimmy gained relief from the relentless scrutiny, but he also lost the stage that had defined his youth. Fans were left puzzled, wondering how someone so admired could disappear so suddenly. That question, where did Jimmy Peatross go, would linger, even as he began building a life away from the bright lights. When Jimmy Peatross stepped away from American Bandstand, he also stepped away from the constant hum of national attention. Unlike some regulars who tried to parlay their television fame into music or acting careers, Jimmy chose the quieter path of ordinary life. For a boy who once seemed inseparable from the rhythms of Studio B, this shift was striking, but perhaps it was the choice that brought him peace. Community records identify him as James Vincent Peatross, born in December 1943, and they note that his life after the cameras was defined not by celebrity, but by steady devotion to work, family, and neighborhood. Friends remembered the charisma that had electrified the bandstand floor, but now it was expressed in smaller ways: a warm smile, a kind word, the steady presence of a man who carried himself with quiet dignity. Philadelphia remained central to his story. The same streets that had nurtured his early love of music and dance became the backdrop for his adulthood. Those who knew him personally recalled a man who never forgot his bandstand years but did not let them consume him. To Jimmy, they were a cherished chapter, not the whole book. By the time of his passing in January 2011, Jimmy's name had largely slipped from the national conversation. Yet among the faithful bandstand fans who still replayed old clips or gathered at reunions, his image lived on. They remembered the boy who won the 1959 Jitterbug Contest, who helped popularize the Strand, and who carried himself with an elegance that defined a generation's afternoons in front of the television. In the end, his life after Bandstand reflected a truth often forgotten: not every teen idol longs for perpetual fame. Sometimes, stepping out of the spotlight is itself an act of strength, a way to find meaning beyond applause. Jimmy Peatross may have lived quietly, but his story endures in the memories of those who watched him dance when the world was young. Jimmy Peatross may have stepped away from the cameras decades ago, but his presence still lingers in the collective memory of bandstand fans. He was the teenager whose sharp dips and smooth turns with Joan Buck set a standard that others tried to follow, the boy who turned an afternoon dance contest into a national moment when he and Joan won the 1959 Jitterbug crown. More than trophies or magazine mentions, his true legacy lies in the way he embodied the joy and promise of youth. American Bandstand was never only about music or steps. It was about ordinary kids given the chance to shine, if only for a moment. Jimmy's story reminds us that those moments, though fleeting, can echo for a lifetime. Do you remember watching Jimmy glide across the floor? Did you try those same moves in your own living room? Share your memories with us and subscribe so these stories of Bandstand will continue to live and dance on.